All right. Good evening, everyone. This is now our seventh podcast of Max and Doyle discussing the great books of the Western tradition. Tonight we have the great honor of a guest whose name is JP. So I'm going to just turn it over to him and let him give a brief introduction to himself.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. It's been a lot of fun, kind of listening to your discussion and the evolution of this podcast. But yeah, I'm currently a fifth year senior at the University of Dallas, studying mathematics and getting my teaching certification. And next year I'll be doing my master's in education. So Max, I'd have had some interesting things to say about education and in terms of Plato's Republic. So
yeah, and just to offer some other background, I met JP, who was sitting behind me in freshman English class in high school.
Yep.
And we had a particularly interesting teacher, and I think we met the moment I turned around and said, "Did you just say that?" JP, I have no idea.
No idea. Yeah.
So yeah, and you've been part of this kind of conversation ever since then. So it's great to include you in the podcast.
Yeah, definitely. Pleasure to be here.
Great. So we were just mentioning before the podcast that Plato's Republic is dry at points, and any attempt to kind of summarize the book through the first five books would be perhaps not as useful as just attempting to broach some of the topics that the interlocutors touch. So I guess with that, I do want to start about a little bit of the narrative elements because despite the fact that a majority of the book is just philosophical dialogue, at the very beginning, it's actually quite rich in drama. And I don't know to what extent that affects the way that we should read the book, but I would assume with as careful of a writer as Plato is, that it's probably important. So I had the great pleasure of translating parts of Plato's Republic in a Greek class in my senior year. And at the same time, we were, Max and I, in a class where we were reading Nietzsche. And there's an interesting kind of, I don't want to say parallel, but I think that Nietzsche is playing off of an interesting literary device that occurs in the first word of the Republic, which is katabain, which means I went down. It's Plato, and I believe he's with Glaucon, right, at the very beginning?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they go down from the city of Athens to the coast, to the Piraeus, to go witness a religious festival. And in Zarathustra, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, there's that device of a going under or a going down is super significant in Zarathustra's development as, well, whatever Zarathustra is. So from that going down, which I think is actually a pretty cool full circle once we get to the end of this discussion tonight with the cave, because there's certainly an element of what is the going down. There's kind of a little bit of a gloss on that, and I don't want to necessarily spoil the party. But after we get this kind of introduction, Glaucon and Plato are held up by Polemarchus, is it?
Yeah. Yes. And they get stopped by a slave.
Yeah, they get stopped by a slave, and they tell him to wait for Polemarchus. And there's this interesting little kind of tarry where Socrates and Glaucon want to get back to Athens, but Polemarchus and his team are like bigger and more strong, and they want him to come talk about justice with them. And so he goes, and then he goes into the house of is it Polemarchus's dad?
Yeah, which is Cephalus. Real quick,
Yeah.
I just wanted to throw a fun historical fact in the going down part.
Sure.
Heidegger, when he originally taught the Republic, taught it cover to cover. And then he said by the end of his teaching the Republic, he used to spend a whole semester on that one sentence.
Oh gosh.
So yeah, there's something in the history of philosophy that gets repeated about this going down. But anyways, let's continue. So they enter Cephalus's house, and Socrates rather boldly just goes, "How's old age going?" and that is where the dialogue starts.
And isn't that conversation that he has with Cephalus really interesting? I almost thought that it covered more ground and at least teased out something of practical wisdom in just the first book. It seems at least very rich and dense compared to the sort of dry monotony of establishing the city.
Yeah, there was something very different about that specific dialogue. In the secondary literature, and I saw this repeated twice, Cephalus is supposed to represent the traditional Athenian. So he's, or that's one interpretation of the text, and that is in his ritual sacrificing that he goes to do to avoid Socrates' questions, and also just in the way in which he values Socrates' speech but not his philosophy, as the Athenians did in the end. So yeah, and then the interpretive literature goes on that once Cephalus leaves, which we can get back to, that the tradition is then ripped apart for the rest of the dialogue.
What did you make of Cephalus's argument that those who inherit wealth are far less likely to fall in love with their money than those who make it for themselves?
JP, you got something on that?
I think part of the reason I love this book so much is because of the different aspects that kind of join together in the vision of justice as they move through the first couple books. Kind of starts with this idea of, okay, well, where's justice come from? How can we defend that as a point? And I think they get to the point where they ask Socrates, okay, so is injustice really what we're after, or is justice really what we're after? Is there something better? And I think it's interesting that they feel the need to make that distinction between whether you make your money or whether it's inherited. Because my first thought is like, what's really the difference between the two? Money is money, but
I think an interesting thing that comes out of the dialogue in terms of the construction of the city is that that each person in the city does what they're most apt to do according to nature. And so I think that the difference maybe between inherited wealth and acquiring wealth is that it's in one's nature to acquire wealth if they're part of the business or craft class of the city. But if you're given wealth through inheritance, wealth or wealth creation might not be in your nature. And so that wouldn't be the thing you love. That's not what your nature's turned towards.
Right.
So in some sense, it gives us a little bit of a practical window into some of the theoretical concepts that we discuss later on in the book.
Yeah. Did you make something?
Would you go so far as to say that the conversation with Cephalus gives us like an interpretive framework with which to understand the whole rest of the dialogue, or do we get that later with the conversation about the first attempt to define justice with Polemarchus?
I think it gives us a start for the entire conversation. I love how it starts off with like you said, Max, just two old men talking about how old age is going. And that to me is the basis for all philosophical thought, is just kind of like just sitting around looking at the world going, okay, what can we glean from these observations? So I think it gives some framework in the sense that it is that walk coming back. It's that constant reflection of, okay, so you can live up in the clouds, you can live in the perfect city, but it always has to start with foundational experience.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that, to use the going down metaphor that we started with, Cephalus is very superficial in the beliefs he discusses, and as soon as things attempt to get deeper, he leaves. And then we get Thrasymachus, which is only deep in the sophist sense of deep, in his ability to use rhetoric. And then we go deeper and we get the long conversation and the discussion of the city. So I think one of the things that Plato's doing with the first conversation is getting his audience prepared for a descent into the topic of justice.
Yeah.
But what follows? Do you want to move on to the next conversation?
Yeah, I mean, so what follows, right, is there's an initial discussion with Thrasymachus, or not with Thrasymachus, with Polemarchus, and I believe Polemarchus's initial definition of justice is paying one's debts, and what's the other half of it?
Helping one's friends and harming one's enemies.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a pretty good attempt at a try. But then the refutation there is that you can't harm anyone, because if you harm people, you make them worse, and a just person can't make people worse, but has to make them better.
Yeah.
And I don't know. Part of me feels that definition of justice was dealt with in a sophistic manner.
I think you're probably right about that. But yeah, and it's interesting because it seems to contradict the definition of justice that comes. Socrates' refutation of it seems to also bring doubt to his definition of justice in the same ways, because part of his refutation there too is he references human fallibility and says that one might not know who their friends and enemies are.
Or somebody's friend might not be a just person or deserve whatever the benefits that you could give them.
But I guess there's also a sense in which it's a very superficial account of justice.
Yeah.
Because one's friends and one's enemies don't encompass the entire polis or the entire city. Because there's too many people in a city for you to be friends or enemies with them. But justice as a political concept has to necessarily go beyond the narrow perspective offered in that definition.
Right, yeah. Because there's something, the justice that's required in a city is a lot bigger than any one individual in his particular network of friends and enemies. Okay, I can buy that. So it's almost as if the reason why the refutation of the argument seems superficial is because perhaps the definition of it itself was not as well thought out.
Yeah. Well, and once again, I mean, they're making the climb down. You have to start at a very surface level to be able to work your way down. You can't just hop into a stricter definition.
And so, I mean, I guess that's a perfect segue into Thrasymachus, where that's the definition that really plunges us into the depths, right?
Yeah.
Justice is what is better, or the benefit of the stronger. I didn't know that I understood well enough the connection between justice is what is better for the stronger and the fact that it's more desirable to be unjust than just.
I think that one is an ontological claim about justice. And so that's when we get into the threefold distinction. Something for its own sake, something for its own sake and its consequences, or only its consequences.
Yeah.
So justice could be, like the Republic, impossible. Like the Republic that they create later could be impossible, but it could be true. And so I think that would be the way I would distinguish it from the effects or consequences of justice and its actual definition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm following that. But I think if I remember correctly, the idea was that if you're the ruler of the city, justice is what you say that it is, with respect to those you are ruling over. But with respect to yourself, more or less, you're only acting in your self-interest. So, but I have trouble from the perspective of the ruler, how is it the case that he's acting unjustly if he is, by the very definition, if his words by definition are justice?
Isn't that where the Socrates draws the contradiction out?
Yes, but I think it's a little bit broader than that. I think they're trying to see, okay, is justice something that is created by our psyche, or is it something that actually is true? Right? Because if the ruler is just going to make up whatever he wants, then there's no reason to argue about the definition of justice because it's arbitrary.
There is something absurdly relativistic about that account.
Right. And I guess that's kind of what I took away from that, is that the question was, okay, can we take justice as can we take justice out of experience, or is it something that we make up to make ourselves feel good?
I mean, that's an interesting question too. I think that Thrasymachus's argument collapses because technically it would create the Republic anyways. Because if Socrates was in charge per se, and we create the actual Republic, and that would be the benefit of the best city, and therefore the benefit of Socrates as the ruler, then it would encompass that definition as well.
Right.
Doyle, did you think that Thrasymachus was what did you think that this section was doing?
Well, I was particularly struck by, I don't know, it seems superficial, but just the extent to which Thrasymachus just wants to be clever in what he's saying. I think I have a tendency to want to say heterodox things. And so I would have expected myself to be more sympathetic to someone who said that justice was the sort of thing that's just the benefit of the ruler, and in actual point of fact, it's better to be unjust than just. Like, those are the kinds of thoughts that are attractive to me. And yet I was actually rather put off by Thrasymachus. And I don't know if that means that I'm put off by my own way of really thinking about questions. Because what you would want to, I would think that the proper way to discover anything is to attempt to tease out a definition, not a theoretical definition first, but a practical definition first, and then see whether or not there's benefit there for people, the city, your life. And then only after you've established that there is a kind of thing as justice, to then move on and discuss it. It's almost like I was left kind of with the assumption that, okay, there is this thing called justice and we have to define it, but I wasn't necessarily sure what the practical implication was.
Yeah, I think this reminds me of something you mentioned in the last podcast, which was Alcibiades being like us in high school, in the way that he approaches philosophy.
Yeah.
And I think that, to go off of our descent concept, when you begin doing philosophy or trying to think about something, you often go off of like a very oversimplified definition that you then stand by with like obscene obstinance towards counter-argument.
Right.
And I think that Plato, in some sense, is giving us a first attempt at the descent that is the way that we might naturally attempt to approach a subject without having any other background in it.
To me, it's not really a discussion of justice. He's using justice as just kind of a placeholder. This is more a discussion of philosophy in general. And to me, Thrasymachus is just an example of a bad philosopher. And so if we're going to make the descent, let's make the descent the right way. And this is Plato's way of saying, okay, here's how you do it wrong. Let's not do it like that.
Is he a bad philosopher, or does he typify a necessary step in the going down that you will eventually hit and eventually need to overcome? Because it seems to me that, this is all sort of coming to me through the midst of this conversation, but it seems to me that a young man is attracted to philosophy when he first hears two old men talking about it, right? And maybe they're not talking well about it, but they're talking about interesting things, and he wants to get himself involved in the conversation. And then, he gets to participate in the conversation, and he gives his answer, and it's an okay one, but ultimately has some holes in it, and he gets defeated. Right, that's the Polemarchus thought. But then the next phase is he's learned a little bit, hasn't learned the essence of philosophy, but has learned how to argue a bit better, and is viewing philosophy merely through the lens of debate.
Yeah, that's actually really, that's a really good point.
That is. Yeah.
I was just gonna go back to the high school point there too. When I first started thinking, it was about arguing, and it was mostly about arguing about politics, and it was mostly about winning the argument.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know if there's any empirical research or any other evidence to bring to bear that this is the way that people sort of descend into thought. But I think that if it is the case, then Plato might be doing something really insightful by giving us Thrasymachus right from the get-go.
Right. Which is that to me, this is the scariest part about this book, is that we're talking about justice, we're talking about philosophy, but we're also talking about just the progression of and the maturing of thought, and how he does it all in a single book is just amazing.
And so where does the descent stop? I mean, and maybe stop is the right word, but when does the going down start to be, when does the descent start to pivot into an ascent? Do you think it happens with Glaucon and Aristodemus, that are true believers and lovers of justice and yet are willing to debate the opposite side of the coin to ensure that they arrive at truth? Is that when you begin your ascent, when you reach the ability to do something like that?
I think you begin your ascent when you go crazy. When you just go absolutely insane, just ask yourself the same questions over and over. But yeah, I think that's definitely when you have the ability to look at other perspectives that you may know to be wrong and debate them, and like you said, just for the sheer purpose of hoping to find truth, that's when you kind of turn around and start heading back up.
Yeah, I see the ascent happening at the Allegory of the Cave. Because I think part of Socrates' method is showing you how ignorant you are, and that allegory epitomizes that. And so I could be completely wrong, but I feel like the first 6 books before we get to the allegory would still be part of the descent, the uncovering, where they're sort of swimming around deeper and deeper into the dark.
So walk me through that. Why is the attempt to establish a city? I mean, it would seem to me that the descent is characterized by a series of negative arguments. Don't be as, I don't know, surface level as, or don't be as unwilling to engage in difficult questions as Cephalus. Don't be as surface level as Polemarchus. Don't be as hot-headed and argumentative as Thrasymachus. But then it seems like with Glaucon and Aristodemus, we arrive at our first kind of positive message, at least in this interpretive framework, and that's do in fact be like Glaucon and Aristodemus, who are willing to put their own beliefs on the line for the sake of something higher than themselves. But then that ultimately leaves us, well, I mean, where the dialogue leads is in fact quite fascinating. I was reminded of when I was in, a younger man, high school, college, saying, yeah, of course, at the ripe age of 23, talking about when I was a younger man. No, but I had kind of similar thought experiments like this, where I would reconstruct the political system according to whatever it was that I saw fit. And I don't know if there's something in that, right? Is Plato using the example of the reconstruction of the city as a sort of reductio against the tendency of young men to want to overthrow the established order and recreate it in accordance with their own desires? So is it just a blanket critique of that phenomenon? 2, is it an indication that that phenomenon might actually have something to offer if it's done properly and well with a guide, someone like Socrates? Or is it 3 that we've actually begun to build ourselves back up now, and that we need, once we've descended far enough, we need kind of these mythological / imaginative creations in which to understand our philosophical concepts before we can attempt to apply them to the real world?
Do you have any? I'm struggling to get at that question. Do you have any intuition there?
Well, it would seem that the what they're doing is they're setting up. Well, I mean, so this is, seems rather evident. I think they start by recreating the mythology of their particular city, right? They go through and they take out things from Homer that they don't, Homer and the other poets that they think that should not be there. They emphasize things that they think are important. They mess around with the poetic style. So they begin by editing the established mythology, and then they proceed to go on to like tell a myth themselves. So I mean, you might perhaps, I mean, I'm tempted to say that perhaps the myth, and whether we're talking about particular myths like Homer and Hesiod, or more specifically societal myths like something like the actual construction of the city appears to be, those the self-understanding and the self-creation of mythology seems to be that first philosophical act.
I think the mythology is focused on first because it's easier to manipulate because it is a creation, and B, it's a lot easier to talk about more abstract concepts in mythology than it is to jump right into more practical details, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm completely lost. Not because of what you said, but because of how complicated this feels.
Yeah, well, how
Okay,
long
well,
are we
let's take a few steps back.
Take a few steps back.
Let's take a few steps.
Yeah, let's talk about Glaucon. Let's talk about Aristodemus. What are they and Socrates actually doing by founding a new city from the ground up?
Well, I found this fascinating in itself, which was if we scale up to a city, we can see something more clearly than if we try it on an individual level. And the essential point there would be that there's transcendent abstract forms that penetrate through the individual up into the collective, but maintain their true form in both. So to just right from the start, we see a very unorthodox approach to truth. There's an assumption built into the attempt to build the city that there's something that transcends the individual and yet is the same in the individual and the city.
Right. It's a metaphysical presupposition.
I think what they're trying to do is avoid getting into the weeds by reconstructing a city, because it would be incredibly difficult to define justice in terms of an individual, given that the infinite complexity of human lives and the number of counterexamples and such that you could bring up. I think constructing a city is sort of a way of bringing our minds into a prejudice-free place to begin understanding justice.
It just takes a personal element out of it.
Well, it takes experience out of it, and it allows us to play with things in a safe environment.
Right.
I also think I talked about the cave at book 7, which is the sort of epistemological place in which we're all born, which is a state of abject ignorance. that is where we get a concrete definition of sort of like human psychology and its ability to get at truth. But we don't get there until we've constructed an entire republic. So I find it interesting that it's sort of as if you have to go far away from what you began looking at and turn around to see that first small point. But Doyle, why do you think that it's through the city, the reconstruction?
Well, it would seem that so kind of Plato starts out with like a very like it's a state of nature sort of argument. So we're talking about a time immemorial, really, when this city would have been formed and according to these principles. Now that we're talking about it, it seems almost as if you can't you can't separate the forms or the definitions you're looking for from the very specific places in which they arise, and their conception of justice would have been corrupted if they had made a mistake in the city, which they mention kind of multiple times. So I wonder to what extent there's something perhaps esoteric going on where we're talking about justice, which is supposedly a form that's a universal, and we're talking about it in the particular context of a mythological city that doesn't exist, but nonetheless, if justice were to exist, it would exist only in this city because it's better than all of the other cities. Right, so it seems like there's a kind of like a critique going on either of justice, which seems less likely, or more likely just of the Greek political system in general, which I think maps on quite nicely with what we do know about Plato and his detest of the democratic system that put Socrates to death.
The political struggles, yeah. Well, and I think the other thing we have to take into account is the Greeks saw the city as everything. Like the city was so much a part of you, much so more than we see our city today.
Well, right. I mean, a Greek city would have been small enough that you more or less would have known everybody that mattered, and they would have
right, yeah.
So is justice a political virtue?
I don't think so. I think that justice is a way of conceptualizing systems that have internal contradictions and yet can be harmonized. I think that whatever the justice described in the Republic turns out to be, which is each part doing its own and by its nature, that could be applied to any complex system that has distinct elements in which contradict one another.
Right. So let me rephrase my question. Not necessarily rephrase, but restate. So polis, more generally speaking, as opposed to political as opposed to social, let's say. Because it would seem that in the modern day and age, we like to throw around the term social justice. And sometimes political justice isn't discussed at all. And I wonder to what extent that's actually a misnomer. Is there even such a thing as social justice?
Well, if there was political justice, we wouldn't have any social justice. So we wouldn't have any need for social justice.
Right. Well, because like human beings are social animals, but
right.
We're higher than social animals. We're political animals.
Right.
Right. So insofar as, I mean, you might even ask the question whether justice exists on the level of society, whatever that means, or does it only exist in a purely political context?
Well, I think to answer that question, we should unpack the three elements given in the book, which are the rational faculty, rules, and then you have the thumos, or the spirited faculty, which protects the city or the individual and keeps the appetites in check, and then the appetites, which are productive.
I've been around for like a couple hundred years.
So do you think so? Then what is that? It's courage is the virtue of the spirit. Moderation is a virtue of the whole soul, but most necessary in the craftsman of the city. And wisdom is the virtue of the ruler. So, like using that structure of wisdom, courage, and moderation, do you think that that's beholden to the political?
That's a good question. It seems to me that at least the trichotomy is a pretty accurate description of it may be a pretty good representation of all societies or political units and of humans. I think you could probably have a discussion about some additional parts of the city or parts of the souls respectively, but I think it's a pretty close approximation. Do you think I'm not so certain though how you can have any kind of functioning human enterprise that doesn't consist of those three parts, right? Because it's not just the city; it's also the business, it's also the university, it's also the bureaucracy itself. Like all of the different institutions that we have set up seem to more or less map onto this trichotomy. Precisely because human beings are political. We have rulers and we also have those who support the rulers and we also have those who are ruled, right?
But I think it goes more than that because I think it also goes down to the individual.
I think that's the reflection that's so strange about this book. Is what degree is justice identical in the individual and in the city?
I think it's completely identical.
That's what I thought as well. And that makes the building of the city in the Republic in some sense is the construction of the best psychology.
Yeah, it's the construction of the best self. It's the construction of the philosopher. Or I guess not the philosopher, but the virtuous man.
I think if we get more specific, that might help us answer these higher level questions.
Go for it.
You want to jump into book 2 real quick? Did we lose the Doyle?
No, go right
Doyle. Oh.
So in book 2, Glaucon and Adeimantus try to defend Thrasymachus and his definition of justice. But they themselves aren't defending it. They're just saying they're going to attempt to give the best account of that. And so their goal in book 2 is to get Socrates to defend justice, not only as being good, but also being good for its consequences. And the assumption in book 2 is that injustice is what's profitable if you can get away with it. So we all have to pretend to be just. We all have to seem to be just to everyone else. Otherwise, we'll pay the price. But really, as soon as we can get away with injustice, we should to our gain.
Favorite part of the book. Favorite part of the book. Because this is just like reciprocal altruism. Doing good things just to feel good about yourself is hilarious to me. And I think so true that we need to constantly be reminded that justice in and of itself should be a goal. But I mean, it took me forever to understand the counter argument to this because I was like, of course, like if I had the opportunity to never get caught, I'm going to do whatever the hell I want.
Yeah. And that's a very interesting question there.
And what is the counter argument, JP?
I mean, the counter argument, I guess, to some extent, is that injustice is not good for the soul and thus can't be a virtue. I mean, I'd be hard pressed to give you a good argument for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would like to think that it's something along the lines of you do bad and materially you succeed, but psychologically, or at least, probably for certain in your family or in your close kind of social network, that things would probably degenerate pretty fast, because you can't screw over a whole bunch of people without other people noticing. And once those other people start to notice, they're going to start to get concerned, and they're going to start, more or less calling you out for it.
Yeah.
I was reflecting on something similar the other day. I've been attempting to write some short and witty kind of societal critiques. And one of the things that I was talking about more, kind of recently, gosh, I lost it.
Well, just to go back a question until you regain your train of thought. In book 2, I think what we get in Plato is really like the first laying out of political science. And what Glaucon and Adeimantus offer is the Hobbesian view of human nature. And that is, given the opportunity to profit from injustice, the human beings will commit injustice. And I think that, so Socrates has to create the Republic to refute this. But I feel like this is a common assumption. And I think there's a beautiful poem that they cite somewhere in here, which is along the lines of, I have it. Vice is in abundance, is easy to choose. The road is smooth, and it lies very near. While the gods have set sweat before virtue, and it is a long road, rough and steep. And I think what Book 2's defense of injustice does is to bring up the sense in which we think that what is good is burdensome, not pleasurable. And that's sort of the task that the city has to be constructed against. That you could create something good that would be good in itself and something that we would all desire.
Right, because I think up to this point, Plato's given a sufficient definition of justice in some ways, but he hasn't, like Doyle said at the beginning, like, who cares? And I think this is the first time we're starting to get into, okay, this is why it's important. This is why what we're talking about is important.
Doyle, did you recollect?
I didn't, but I think more or less where I was going is that the fact of the matter is that injustice or dishonesty, radical dishonesty, isn't something that's tenable, because you yourself don't have the wherewithal to point blank express one thing to be good while at the same time seeking another thing which you say to be good. And I don't know what that says about human beings, because I think there are a lot of figures in history, and even maybe figures in kind of just in modern consciousness, that we can point to as people who seem to exude one sort of virtue, they claim to, and then they turn out to be a total fraud. And I wonder to what extent that phenomenon is what Plato is talking about here. Because the only reason that we know about those individuals is because they were found out. Right? We're not talking about the ones that seemed virtuous and then, we never found out later that they weren't. The fact that they were exposed is evident there. And so it seems almost as if by broaching this topic, there's a little piece of practical advice there is, beware attempting to speak one thing and do another, because you will be found out eventually. There is no ring of Gyges, and you yourself will go mad should you attempt to do something like that.
Yeah, and I think that is implied in the rest of the book as well, and that's that injustice is insustainable because, unlike justice, it's not harmonized in itself. So I agree. There is the sense that to be unjustly, whether found out or not, is to create a regime, whether in the soul or in the city, that cannot sustain itself.
Yeah, it might be fun. Like the Ring of Gaijis is a great example. It's fun for a while, but it's just not applicable. It's not sustainable.
But I think also that we get that there's a very dark aspect of the human psyche that comes through this, and that's best captured in the Ring of Gaiji's story. But by the end, they're talking about, or one of the lines is, "To seem outmuscles even truth." And I think one of the political reflections here is that the majority of people want to see appearances in their leaders, in the unjust. They don't want to see the true nature of those things. There's kind of a comfort in assuming
willful ignorance.
So, do you want to move on to the city and its construction?
Surely.
Cool. So, Socrates says that the city comes into being from men not being able to provide for themselves. Essentially, you just can't be both a farmer and a shoemaker and a smith and so on. So that's why men come together originally.
The basis of education.
And then Socrates describes this very austere city with only a few people working in it, some making food, some clothes, and a few other things. And Glaucon objects that this is an incredibly boring city and that we need luxury.
Which is the best part, because that in and of itself is the only thing. Like, we could be perfectly happy in that boring city, but there's something about human nature that wills luxury, that wills towards something more.
Yeah, and I think the reflection there is that the appetites can never be overcome. They can only be mediated by more rational forces.
Trying to overcome those appetites it's a useless task.
Yeah, because things naturally progress. We get to a place of better standards of living and then demand more from them.
Because deep down, we're all still 6-year-olds asking for more.
Yeah. But then from here, because they go after luxury, Socrates says, well, if we're going to have this much expansion, then we're probably going to trespass on other people's territories, and we're going to need an army class.
Then we got to fight them.
That's where we get the guardians.
Right.
And I think here's the first time where education enters the picture.
Right. Right, because if we didn't need to control an appetite, or we didn't have an appetite, there'd be no need for any combat. We wouldn't need to combat anything, right? We would just continue to live our lives. There'd be no conflict.
It's really interesting too, in the sense that the appetite is necessary, and they let it expand in the city.
Yes,
but they don't synonymize the appetite with injustice, and yet that would seem to be exactly what the appetite does.
Right, tends toward injustice.
Is want beyond it, to want more, and
but
to
I think that's the point of the boring city. That's boring. Who wants that? Like, the appetite might tend towards something that may or may not be unjust, but humans would rather take that risk than be boring. That's the distinction between like animals and humans, right? Is the need for something more luxurious, the appetite of it all. Which I think is interesting because a lot of times we attribute appetite towards our animalistic instincts.
And yet they're necessary so that we eat and
Right.
are close.
Right.
So it's sort of, in some sense, that which is the part of the city and in the soul of producing injustice and greed, the appetites.
It's necessary.
It's necessary.
Yeah. There's some necessity for injustice.
Or the
I don't
potential.
know. I think we're missing
The potential
a little
for
bit.
injustice.
I think it's more the potential for injustice.
Yeah.
And I don't even want to say that. It's simply that by its nature, the passions desire to rule because they are numerous. They are very good at bringing in good things to both the body and the city. They make all of the money. They think they ought to be in charge of things. What we learn is that though that's not a bad thing. However, when it starts to believe that it should rule, perhaps that's when we start to stray. I mean, it's an interesting to consider, along with the claim that perhaps if, particularly in the United States, and maybe it's been a few years since, it's been since Trump's election and campaign, the thought was, let's run the country more like a business and then the country will be better off. It would seem that Plato is advising us strictly against that sort of simplification of the task of ruling to the task of running a business.
I really like that analogy. And the very interesting thing too about the dialogue is that Plato spends almost no time on the appetite class or the craftspeople and businessmen, but spends 2.5 books describing the guardians.
Right. I mean, I think the idea is that we already know pretty well what those things look like.
Right. The appetites take care of themselves.
They don't need further explanation or examination. Only the things that restrain them do.
Right.
Because there's a legitimate question, why restrain them at all?
Yeah. Because they do such good things, they bring in such good things. Why restrain the good that they bring?
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of a fundamental question about political economics, as you were saying, Doyle. Whether the unrestrained free market produces the most good for the city, or whether it must be restrained by something else.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because, free market capitalism in the last 15 years has brought more people out of poverty than in the history of the entire world. So it's undoubtable the good things that it's capable of bringing in. But then you also consider some of the crazy capitalistic stories of, say, the 1600s and like the East India Company, where you had these corporations that more or less were acting as sovereign nations and raising armies and hiring mercenaries. So there's definitely some, the good and the bad come together with respect to the passions, and that's precisely why you need this element, or two elements actually, that rule above them. And I wonder I wonder what Plato's city and just his definition of justice more generally would look like instantiated in the 21st century in the United States, for example. There's in book, I think it's in book 5, when they finally we've discussed the city, we've defined it, we've explained it. Well, then we go and now that we've proven that it's good in and of itself, we have to see how could it be possible to instantiate. And Socrates says, well, we would want to instantiate it with as few changes as possible to the current society.
Right.
The implication being that you don't want to mess with things unnecessarily, even though we just went to the trouble of defining this beautiful system. We're going to instantiate it with as few changes to modern society as is possible. And what he says is that simply the philosophers should rule. And that would be a pretty close approximation to everything that they had hitherto said.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that that's true in the 21st century.
You don't think philosophers should rule the world?
Maybe that's just because of the kinds of people that are philosophers, at least in the public mind these days.
Well, yeah, no, I definitely think that's true. Socrates' understanding of who the philosopher is nothing like even the last 500 years of philosophy offers.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's what's interesting about Plato, Aristotle, just kind of the ancients in general, is that they don't have a particular, it would seem they don't have a particular project in mind.
No, they're just chilling, drinking wine, talking about whatever.
They read the scrolls of the ancients and they talk about them, and they attempt to tease at the most difficult existential questions. Whereas the later philosophers, they seem to have discovered that philosophy was useful for something, when precisely the point in the ancients is that philosophy is the most useless of the sciences, and that's why it's so wonderful.
Yeah, it's a very, like, the way in which the just city and the just soul is set up with the philosophers at its head, sort of has this Buddhist sense of like self-enclosedness, which would be like the goal is not to strive after progress or the generation of technology, or some future like utopia. The goal is to create a system that is harmonized such that it can persist through time. It's not striving after a good. The only good it strives after is the freedom of its people and its maintenance as a city.
Right. Well, I think you see that reflected in mathematics. The history of mathematics is that the transition from pure mathematics to more applied mathematics, and whether it be topology, which started off as a section of mathematics that was strictly pure, and now we've found uses for it, the innovations have kind of declined. And there's something to be said about a pure philosophy versus what is now a philosophy for application.
Yeah, and Doyle, I think we talked about this last time in terms of love as the striving towards the true form of beauty to create something of immortality. Like, there's no sense of utility or progress, and I really like that. Maybe there's a fundamental distinction between the way in which we reason for its own sake and just towards what is true and truthful, and then the way in which we reason for some practical use.
I think that the loss of leisure is perhaps to blame in that phenomenon, right? The reason why, what's interesting about 3rd century Athens is that it's, these guys, these are the wealthy guys. They've inherited all of their wealth. They maybe spend 15 hours managing whatever affairs they have to ensure that their lands keep producing their wealth. But they're able to use their wealth as a means to actually live the life of leisure. They go to the gymnasium. They go and talk about the scrolls of the ancients. They go to the temple and offer sacrifices and all of these other things. The rich in our society precisely do the opposite. Yeah. The rich are the ones that work more and more and more and more and more, right? A great example of something like this is Elon Musk. Right? Yeah. Like, you'd expect the guy, after he, makes a bunch of money in the sale of PayPal, that he'd go and retire and at the, ripe age of 30 or whatever and become a philosopher. At least that's what would have happened earlier, but our society is structured that, nope, I'm going to take all of the money I just made selling PayPal and I'm going to invest it in SpaceX and Tesla and Solar City. And, now the guy has even more and more money. But the point is that the rich don't leisure in the 21st century. The rich work more.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that could be a fundamental sickness of our
Do you think that's true of the political class in our society?
I don't know what's true of the political class. I don't really know what Washington politicians do with their time, and I don't know that I really care either.
Well, I was just thinking that, like Elon Musk would be an example of like the appetites, but it's not the appetites either.
We kind of have a
So that,
weird,
but
like,
we don't look up to our leaders. Like the word most associated with politician in our lexicon is liar.
Yes.
And I don't know, that's very interesting in terms of the Republic.
Because the Guardians and even especially the complete Guardians or the Philosopher Kings are an object to which one can strive.
but I don't in the city, there's no upward progression. Versus in our modern time, there is an extreme importance placed on upward progression.
Yeah, and that's one of the really fascinating things about the dialogue too. Plato seems to think that by the age of like 5 or maybe 7, you will know a child's nature well enough to know whether it should be a guardian or part of the masses.
Right.
He gives this very deterministic sense of human nature, that we're sort of born with a nature and aptitudes, and that is as far as we can take them.
Which I don't know if I have a good refute to that. I mean, I think there can be some upward progression within your, whether it's an appetite or a guardian or a philosopher. I think you can move throughout that category, but I don't know if I could come up with a good counter argument for only being able to stay in that one place.
Jordan Peterson talks a lot about how if you're not properly socialized by the age of 4, you've been done a serious injustice because you're never going to achieve the kind of socialization that you needed.
Yeah, apparently that's based on a ton of psychological literature as well.
Well, and Aristotle makes the same claim. He says if you don't learn temperance in your youth, like as an infant, like he takes temperance very seriously and says you have to train temperance into a child when they're an infant, and that if they don't learn temperance in infancy, then they'll never be temperate.
Right.
Which would seem to kind of both of those points would seem to bolster Plato's notion that those who are born for guardianship are not meant to be the masses, and vice versa. What do you think? I don't mean to pivot this in the middle of the discussion, but I think it's kind of a little bit of an elephant in the room. What do you think of Plato's use of like political lies as well as political lies covered up by religious ideology?
Oh, I love it. I love it. I think it's great. I think the best part about the city is completely open and honest. Like, this is not about like everybody gets a say. This is not about equality. This is about equity. We're going to make the most people happy, but not everybody's going to get to, make all the decisions. There's some people that just aren't suited for that.
Well, yeah, not everyone's going to get to understand the truth.
Right.
I think what Plato's saying there is that most people are incapable of the kind of reasoning which would lead to the virtuous life. And therefore, they require being lied to about their origins, the gods, and a whole manner of things.
Right.
Because otherwise, they would just fall into disarray.
Well, and I think lying, and it's not even lying in so much as not revealing the whole truth, in that is such a...
That was an equivocation.
Well,
what they do in the dialogue is they define lies as particular misstatements of the truth that lead one away from the good.
Okay, so lies that
come up with a series of lies that are not true but lead one to the good, and therefore they have exempted themselves from lying. I mean, they've gone out of their way to figure out a justification of lying before they before they make the lies.
Right. Because I think that type of lying is foundational to quality education. I think you have to have some of that. Because if you just dumped like the entire truth on somebody, humans, most people in general don't have the capacity to be able to comprehend everything all at once. Especially if the lies lead towards the good, then
Yeah, I see. I'm sort of repulsed by this notion. And
why is that? Because I feel like in our conversations, our relationship is kind of shown that to be true.
Well, here's the reason why I'm repulsed by it, particularly the notion, the link between lies and education. It seems to me that there's a grand difference between a withdrawal of the fullness of an idea and the blanket misuse of a position of power to inculcate something that is not true. So, for example, I have my theories about, philosophers in general, what they're up to. And
what are those guys scheming?
And frankly, I don't think that those thoughts are the best to tell someone who's at the beginning of a philosophical education, say as a fresh college. Right? There is a certain level of the what would you call it? Not the enlightened, but those who have suffered through starting the Republic and going all the way up through, Nietzsche into the 20th century and reading all these things and coming to certain conclusions for oneself is important. And there's a certain withdrawal that the perhaps more experienced student of philosophy has to do in the presence of a younger one so as not to crush their studiositas, right? Their earnest desire to learn. But I think that's very different from saying that lies are at the foundation of education.
It's a very cynical view of human nature.
Thank you.
I
appreciate that.
Well, it's just that I could tell you what's good and why it's good, but you're not going to listen. So I need to tell you a complete fairy tale about the nature of reality.
But I think that's the point, is like, since Plato's position is that you can't move up in classes, that the only way to ensure a just city is through the use of these quote unquote lies.
But so why? So I think that what repulses me in this is that the good is not something that you can convince people of. And that's why I'm so repulsed by it.
No, because I don't think it's about convincing. I don't think he's trying to convince anybody. I think it's more about understanding. I mean, if they can't understand it, then there's no convincing. There's no right wrong in this. It's just a strict understanding of it. And if they need, stories about the gods to understand justice, then that's what they need.
So I have just an interesting insertion / comment. So what is the function then of the appetites, the retailers, the business people who invent some kind of enterprise software that makes the running of the bureaucracy go smoother? There has to be some fundamental understanding of the way that the government is set up and how it works, such that they can come up with an innovative solution to problems that are being experienced. So it would seem that there are goods that can be achieved through the real grasping of what's truly going on at the political levels. That's good for everyone, even though it doesn't take the business person out of the rung of business person. That still is helping society as it moves forward.
I would say that the appetites wouldn't know that what they're doing. They wouldn't have a complete understanding of the impact that that idea has.
Well, Doyle, could you rephrase that?
Well, so I'm thinking in the context of the 21st century, we have a bloated bureaucracy, as does every other Western nation, and it has inefficiencies because of the way that it's set up. And an entrepreneur comes along and invents some way of allowing the government to act more smoothly by using some new software platform or something like that. Fundamentally, the entrepreneur is not a member of the ruling class, but because there is transparency with how the ruling class does its work and its function, the entrepreneur is able to use his craft to better the city and make it run more efficiently. So it would seem that there's far more to be gained from being open and honest and transparent with those who are ruled, not because they have the possibility or the capability of moving up in the ladder, which in our society obviously they do, but those things don't seem to be commensurate. Like, you don't need one to have the other. You can still have people that can't move up the ladder that can come up with innovative solutions that help society at all of its levels, including the level of the ruler.
Yeah, let me see if this helps answer the question, and if not, let's return to it. But I think that something Plato just jumps over in his describing, like, what you do in the city is what you're most apt to do, and we know this from how you are as a child. And yet, for instance, in my case, I'm working at a business now, but I want to do something else later. With psychometrics, with advisors, with mentors, with self-reflection, I still have no idea what my best nature is suited towards. And I think that's why that transparency is necessary, because I might find what the city needs in that sense and go pursue that. But I don't think that it's so easy as to ascribe to someone's nature a proper role.
No, but we have to remember that the city is still more used as a symbol to represent human nature. Well, so while it might not be easy for you to go ahead.
Let's get back to that, because I do want to dive deep into the metaphor relationship.
Okay.
Just sticking on the political level. Doyle, do you think that contributed to what you were saying?
I do. I think that Plato is too smart of a person to not have meant something else by dropping these lies into the city. And I'm wondering if we can't return to our original interpretive framework as the descent of how one becomes a philosopher. You might wonder if, when he first starts being an authentic philosopher, if he has recourse to lying because it's easier it's easier to lay those foundations on lies. But then eventually we get to the beginning of book 7 and the allegory of the cave, and the training that the guardian undergoes is, or not necessarily the training, the call of the guardian is to go back into the cave to set other people free and to bring them up. There's a salvific element to education in the latter half of the book that does not seem to be present in the beginning.
I like that.
It's not part of this overall interpretive framework we've been teasing out.
I'd like to restructure my thinking from before. And just kind of the way you put that reminded me of, in our education classes, we talk about the difference between a teacher who's surviving and a teacher who's thriving. And a teacher who survives teaches out of the textbook, uses slides, uses a lot of worksheets because it's easy, right? Because you're dealing with a lot of other things like classroom management. and the more advanced teacher, the teacher who can thrive, has the ability to set aside the worksheets and all that other stuff to kind of go deeper into something. So I would agree. I think that there's the lies are maybe that surviving instinct, that basic instinct, because it is easy.
Let's start with a lie, and then
start there, and we'll see if we can get to the point where they have a true understanding.
So do you think
but it's from the perspective of the teacher is what I'm trying to say, right? It's like
right.
It's not for the teacher uses the excuse of a lie because they think it's easier, but then they come to a more full understanding of who they are,
right?
And they realize they need to put the lies behind them,
right? Yeah.
Well, should we just move from the city level to the soul level then?
Why not?
Because one of the interpretations I had of the lies that they create at the very beginning in book 2 was that in some sense we're born sort of disordered. Like no one's born with a just soul. And so given that there's part of our psyches, and we know this from modern neuroscience, we have to, in some sense, lie to parts of our psyche, to our spirit or to our appetite, in order to get to a place in which harmony can occur. And I think if we take the education of the guardians on board there, it's not that the entire thing is lied to. It's just that a part of it is. And that's to get it into a state in which reason can govern. So it's sort of as if the spirit in each doesn't have the rational capacity to understand its role. Like the metaphor used in the book is the spirit is like a dog. It wants to attack unfamiliar things, and it loves its owners. And so maybe the lie is the ordering, like the potential for ordering the soul.
I'm still not comfortable with the use of the lying terminology, because it would seem far more efficacious to learn how to negotiate with those low resolution subpersonalities that you have. Right?
Who's got
they're
time
there and they're with you.
Who's got time for that? Like if we're trying to get something done, like after a while you gotta start somewhere. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, well, where's a good place to start? It's Doyle, clean your room today, and I'll go and I'll buy you a book at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's rather. I mean, what's the appropriate lie in that circumstance? Clean your room, or else I'll kill you. I mean,
that seems a bit extreme, but I do see what you're saying. I think there's a line to be had.
Well, I think with the appetites and the spirit need, which of course would be different inside an individual soul, but they need a kind of hope that is completely impractical given the current evidence. I think that's where the lie enters the picture.
Yeah, that's where the line is.
It's sort of like you have to accept something that, if examined closer, would be ludicrous. But that thing, that narrative or that truth will locate you in a place where eventually you can order your soul.
Right. So I think you have to shoot for that perfect zone of where it's challenging but not too challenging, and I think that's where the lies come in. Is you have to make it a little bit more believable, I guess. And I being an education person, I always go back to this, but Vygotsky, he an educational theorist, he talks about the zone of proximal development, where it challenges the student just enough, but still leaves more to be desired, and doesn't challenge them, push them outside of their comfort zone. And I think if you push the appetite and the guardian outside of their comfort zone, then the whole city falls apart.
They'll overreact.
Right, they'll overreact because of their nature.
Huh. So it's sort of like there's a sense that I can't tell you what I like. I can't tell you what the nature of things are.
Right. You can't handle the truth.
But I'm going to give you some red meat so that you start running
Right.
in the direction of the truth.
Right.
And
start with some training wheels.
And maybe that's the function that the lie serves. It's like here, I can't tell you, like you're not going to tell a middle schooler about existential crises.
Well, yeah, they're already going through enough. You want to drop that on them?
Yeah,
but I want to draw the distinction there between withdrawal and dishonesty.
Fair.
So do you think Plato's wrong then?
I think that he is. I don't know that he's wrong. I think he's way too smart of a thinker to be wrong. I think he's trying to get us to think about these things, right? It's like it would seem to me, and this is again an interpretation that's all of an hour old. That there is there's a descent into philosophy that requires first you to grow in a little bit of substance and have some substantial things to offer, but that's not enough. Eventually you need to be able to go so far down where it seems that the only thing that can ground you are ridiculous lies. And then you need to go down even further and you realize why your lies were incorrect in the first place.
So don't you think that that's the role that the stories of the gods and the poems, don't you think that that's the role that it plays?
I think that at least the Republic has a pretty negative view of poetry. Yes. And that's something that I don't know that I'm prepared to talk about because there's a lot to talk about, but
that's a lot, yeah.
What all they did in the academy was read the scrolls of Homer and Hesiod and talk about them. So I'm really not so certain that the critical view of the poets that is portrayed in the Republic is, shall we say, a full unveiling of Plato's thought on the matter.
You mean Plato lied? He might have
he
lied a little bit.
He certainly withdrew.
Withdrew, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's sort of like the path away from innocence.
Yeah.
Requires, I wouldn't say falsity, but it requires a story in which truth can emerge. And that story has to be safe enough, as you were saying, JP, to get the students to move towards something, but not so dangerous that they end up repulsed by the whole project.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because we talk about at the University of Dallas, we have a great books program where everybody's required to read, all the Western tradition stuff that you guys have been reading. And they always talk about students that in the first class, the first lit trad class that we take, the students that have the ability to discuss simpler rhymes like hickory dickory dock, like if they feel comfortable talking about that kind of very basic, very fundamental types of literature, they have a lot easier time expanding into stuff like Plato and Homer. You have to start with some ridiculous notions to get to something more.
And so I guess what Plato's saying in that way is since we're going to have to invent a ridiculous notion, we might as well invent it such that it's incorrupting.
Right. Yeah.
Like the gods are all good. Poetry shouldn't be read in such a way where the characters should be imitated. That Hades or the afterlife isn't painful. So it's sort of like, let's alleviate all of these surface fears that begin in a student when they enter something.
Right.
By giving them some boundary conditions that later they'll sort of have the complexity to see aren't scary. But at the time of their youth, they can't comprehend the more complex versions of the truth.
Right.
And so we've got to walk them somewhere. But that place isn't, it's sort of as though the lie that gives rise to truth cannot be incompatible with truth.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Ultimately, this discussion has reinvigorated my reading of Plato, and I'm really excited to go back and read the second half, 6 through 10.
That's what this was all about. This is all for you, Doyle.
Hey, well, we did it. I mean,
We did it.
we did it. We've got. I think, at least for me, the what I gained from this was kind of an interpretive structure with which to make sense of that first word of the Republic.
Yeah.
I go down, and I'm really looking forward to whether or not we find the bottom of that descent in books 6 through 10, or whether or not there's a literal ascent at the end.
Yeah.
So why is it that philosophy is a descent before it's an ascent? What's the significance of that?
I think it's a very superficial claim that's also incredibly deep. That's expressed in Aristotle's Metaphysics in the first book. But it's that we walk around the world and we're given the story about it. And so we have appearances. These are people. These are family. This is friendship. This is our political system, and so on. And I think the descent is the penetration of those things under their surface. It's that we're naturally wired to sort of see what we see and hear what we hear and believe what we're told. And the descent in philosophy is akin to the uncovering of what's beneath what seems.
Yeah. The stripping away of everything that is previously thought to be known, so that you can take a step back and reevaluate it.
It's wonderful because it's so dramatic. Right? I mean that in the sense that philosophy is the drama of a philosopher.
Right.
Well, one of the things that I disliked about epistemology and even metaphysics to a certain extent, not at least in our metaphysics class, we read some great readers that didn't do this, but or great writers that didn't do this. But there's a sense of, at least in the epistemology that I read, that we're putting everything into the proper boxes, and all we're learning through philosophy is expanding the number of boxes that we know the names of. And there's something precisely not that, which philosophy is, that I think Plato is really getting at with this story of the Republic. That there's the individual drama of the philosopher as he learns and develops and grows, and ultimately what I love about the Allegory of the Cave in book 7, and I did read it for tonight's podcast, but I'm looking forward to reading it in the particular context of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, is the salvific element of the philosopher. Right, he has a responsibility once he kind of gets himself in order, once he adjusts his eyes to the light of the sun,
right,
to plunge himself back into the darkness to try and bring back followers.
And I think that, like you guys had talked about in the symposium, was kind of it ending with Socrates talking about the distinctions between dramatic plays and comical plays. And I think in some ways that the descent and ascent of a philosopher plays out those two scenarios.
Right.
Where it is a very dramatic and at the same time ends up being very comical.
Yeah, I think that there's I got this from writing my thesis on Wittgenstein. In his philosophical investigations, he only writes in aphorisms. So it's just the first one's lettered or numbered 1, and then he says something, and then 2, and he says something, and at any point he changes direction. And I think in some sense, the point of a philosophic work is not so much that you believe what it says, but that you journey through it, and something inside is changed in that journey.
Right.
And I think that that sort of gets at what we were talking about before, about the possibility of the Republic, about whether or not the lie is good. It's not the words themselves in a work like the Republic. It's our journey through those words in which it becomes valuable. So it's not that you like get something literal in terms of I believe what Plato believes or I don't. It's that I examined reality in a deeper and new way.
I really like that, Max.
Just tickles my heart.
So, I mean, honestly, with that, I think we might be in the position to go into our moral takeaway from the book right before concluding everything out. What do you think?
Can I throw in one more idea before we do that?
Sure.
So I wrote a philosophical dialogue for JP and Tony because I was unable to describe a certain position that I tried for 2 hours with each of them to describe. And part of that dialogue includes me examining the metaphor of the cave. But I think like one of the strange things about the cave is that like it's sort of what everyone knows and associates with philosophy, but no one seems to notice how damaging it is and terrifying.
Right.
Yeah.
Like those who are in the cave will call something love and live their entire lives in the cave thinking that thing is love and die never having known love.
Mm-hmm.
Like the epistemological place he puts humanity in the cave is so ignorant and so confused about the nature of its existence that it's incredibly dark. And I guess my question is, how would you know if you were still in the cave or not?
If things are really easy, you're probably doing something wrong. I just feel like if you're very certain about things, if you are unbelievably certain, you're probably wrong.
I think too, it just the story in general encourages a certain level of humility.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not only about certainty, it's also about just the acknowledging the fact that the world is more complicated than you can bear, that you yourself are more complicated than you can bear. And
I guess
thus that ultimately I would say yes, I agree with you that the fact that human beings are put in the cave is pretty devastating. But I think it also gives us a radical hope that there is somebody who can come down from outside the cave and unshackle us and lead us up into the sunlight.
Let me try.
Right. It's only if we know how bad it is that we can hope for a savior.
Mm-hmm. But let me try it with a more practical example. After we're done with this podcast, I'm going to call my girlfriend and say something akin to "I love you." If my concept of romance is still a concept that's stuck in the cave, I'm in some sense living in the shadows of that thing and thinking that it's true.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, like, how would you? That's why my question was like, what is the ascent? How do you get to the true forms of things? Because living as though what you believe is true and being in a condition like the cave and not knowing whether or not you're seeing the true form or not is kind of terrifying, because we all have to go and live based on our understanding of the world.
Indeed. I mean, I'm just going to stick with my claim that it's a call to humility. It's that I don't know what I don't know, but this is my best attempt given what I do know.
Right.
And I think authentic self-examination will put you where you need to be or not.
Agreed.
I honestly don't know if when I say I love you, it's the true form of love, but I'll keep calling you my girlfriend.
Right. I don't think you're supposed to know. I don't think that's the point. But also at the same time, when you see somebody that claims to know, it's your job to their claims.
Indeed. Philosophy,
And
I mean, if I
drag
learned
them.
anything from Heidegger, it's that philosophy is way more about the asking the right questions than attempting to get the answers to them.
Yeah.
Just means, so I think, Max, the fact that you're able to ask a question like that means that you're probably light years ahead of many of us who haven't even considered that before.
Right. You might not know, but at least you're, working your way upwards. You might not have gotten there yet, but we're working on it.
Yeah, sort of as if one must suffer philosophy.
Right.
One must suffer philosophy.
One must suffer philosophy. What a beautiful quote.
Is this the true form of that thing? Nope, that's a rock. Keep climbing.
Exactly. Every
All
time,
right. With that, let's go to moral takeaways. JP, we can start with you.
Moral takeaways. I think we summed it up well at the end. I mean, I think the moral takeaway is humility. I think that is the basis of the ascent out of the cave. If you don't have some humility, there's no chance for you to strive upwards.
Max?
I'm trapped in thoughts. One of my thoughts was that if you just take Plato's Republic about a metaphor for harmonizing the parts of the soul, that harmony would only be the beginning. And so I think we tend to think of like harmony internally as being harmony externally, but I think one of Plato's lessons is that if you get yourself in order, then the challenge begins. So there's sort of this question of that maybe what philosophy is seeking after is the greatest responsibility. I know that was completely haphazard.
That was, yeah. I mean, I expected nothing less.
I guess don't confuse the good life with the happy life. Don't confuse putting things in harmony with things being finished.
It's a good start.
Yeah, something along those lines.
Yeah.
I think my moral takeaway is that, well, I think oftentimes I like to believe that things that have happened to me that have, caused the kind of shakings and the rupturings of foundations within myself, I like to think that those are perhaps sufficient enough to call my descent. But insofar as they were involuntary and they were things that happened to me rather than things that I actively participated in, I think what I have a need to do is to, again, descend firstly into my self-identity, but then more ultimately to begin to ask some of the more fundamental questions again. Because I think I've allowed myself to become a little bit complacent about first principles, and as a result, I don't actually know what I believe at the underpinnings of everything. And I think that is sourced in a little bit of lack of self-knowledge, but I think it's also probably sourced in a little bit of pride as well. And so I think, if nothing else, I've learned from the Republic that I need to look again at my path through life and determine whether or not I descended low enough before I started to rebuild.
No, I just wanted to reiterate that that's what, in some sense, I was trying to say as well. There's like the complacency of things being in harmony are not their end.
Mm-hmm.
But just so I don't ruin my great reputation, I wanted to just give one quick epistemological thing. And that is the lesson of don't confuse the singularity of a word with a singular definition. And so justice in the end isn't a single thing. It's the harmony of differing things. And then that epistemological concept works vice versa. But it's so easy to ask, what is love? What is justice? What is good? What is true? And to sort of assume that we're talking about a singular thing.
Mm-hmm.
When some concepts that are dual are better expressed singular and vice versa.
Well, I think, gentlemen, that's a good place to end our conversation for the evening.
Yep.
All right. Well, with that, thank you, JP, for joining us tonight. It was a real pleasure to have you join us.
Of course, yeah, it's great to be on here. I mean, you guys are doing it. You guys are doing it big, and these are the conversations that need to be had.
We're trying, man. You know, I don't know how many people actually make it this far through our podcast, if anyone, but
just like we said, it's not necessarily about the end. It's also about just the journey to get there. So.
Indeed. Max, thanks again as always for joining me in this endeavor, and thank you to everyone who listened. Have a great night. Cheers.